All right, we are live. So, entering the stream is the TikTok famed, renowned doctor, professor, psychologist, Dr. Gordon. Here to talk about personality types and the possible uh, utility of knowing them. So, yeah, so I guess that would be my first question. Um, would be what is the utility in knowing your um, personality type? What's the exact like point?
Sure. Um, the first thing I'll say is I don't know if this first one is a point or the point, but I do think people just like to know about themselves. I do think people just like to kind of understand where they're coming from or understand how they're similar or certainly different than other people, and maybe what makes that so. Um, One of the things that Myers says in her book, I think it's called Gifts Differing, she talks about how knowing who you are can alleviate some of the pressures that a person might feel when they see other people doing things that they're not necessarily good at or that they're not necessarily interested in. Um, and there's been some dispute over her intent in this particular way, but I also think that it can help. I don't think it's definitive, but I think it can help a person understand the types of roles or the types of careers or the types of vocations, certainly the types of interests or hobbies that they might be drawn to or that might be more interesting to them, and perhaps that they might be a little better at. That better at is the one that is a little more controversial to say, but it is the type of thing that when she did research in personality, she did see that, you know, if you take any given job that has any kind of specific duties or specific intelligences that are needed, you often do see that there's kind of a grouping of certain types, even a certain type within that career. And so maybe it doesn't demonstrate that a person can or could be good at a thing, but it does seem to demonstrate that people are interested in certain careers, in certain jobs or roles based on their type.
And do you think that so? I guess we see that maybe it can sort of help us in that way, but do you think it does?
Well, do you mean is it actively used in that way, and are people making use of it? Or do you mean, given what we know with science and how the personality type indicator tends to be used, is that what it's doing?
Yeah, yeah. Like, is it accurately sort of doing what it says it's doing? Yeah.
I'm sorry to just keep clarifying. So, in terms of like typing, or in terms of like getting people into certain roles, careers, or both?
Both. Yeah.
Sure. Um, a long time ago, I did a YouTube video on called "Why the Myers Briggs Isn't Bullshit." It accompanied an article that I wrote for Psychology Today of the same title. I think I might have had to take out bullshit for Psychology Today, but it's an assessment, and any assessment can get it wrong. One of the things I say in that video is that the map is not the land. That is to say, just because, for instance, you draw a map of the place, that map can get things wrong. That map can, have inaccuracies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the land isn't there. That doesn't necessarily mean that the land isn't pretty close to what the map is saying. And so, in the same way, I feel like it's definitely possible. It's definitely possible that a person can take a test on the first time or on the 100th time and get a wrong typing. Um, but I don't think that necessarily invalidates the theory that we can divide or split up or categorize or understand people in the way laid out in that test, in that assessment. Um, so I do think it has some accuracy to it, and for my money, it's the one that I would look to. If that's not obvious, it's the one that I would look to get to know somebody or to understand where they're coming from, et cetera, et cetera. Over other personality tests, I'm sure I haven't looked at them all, but of the most popular ones, I would say that this is the one that, for me at least, kind of speaks the most by looking at their type, by looking at what those types mean. For me, particularly looking at their functions underlying their type, that gives me more information than, say, their big five or some other personality test.
Gotcha. So I guess my next question would be why these particular categories? Why not other categories? Um, so like we have extroversion and introversion. Why don't we like have ambiversion in there as well? Or yeah, other categories. Why these categories?
You know, if you the all of this came from Carl Jung's book. It's called I think it's just called Psychological Types. And in this book, I bought this book when I got into the Briggs maybe a decade, 5, 10 years ago. And I remember picking it up and I was planning to read it cover to cover. And I remember thinking, is this the right book? He's talking about like ancient Greek and Roman philosophers. He's talking about literature from, his modern time and then kind of classic literature. He's talking about the psychological theories, not necessarily connected to personality, or so I thought. But what he was doing was as I kept reading, it turns out that he's kind of building a case of this is how we've thought of people, whether we knew it or not. We've always thought of people, or you'll see a lot that we think about people in terms of being outgoing, in terms of being talkative, in terms of being attentive to the world around them. And we've thought of people being shy, people being introspective, people being to themselves, people not liking to be, that there's all of these different ways that we've thought of people. And what he's trying to demonstrate is that these are the pieces of the puzzle that we have been doing, or that we at least recognize in terms of differentiating people for a very long time, right? That's why he's going back to, ancient Greece and all of these things, is to say that we've always kind of thought about people as having this introvert extrovert distinction, or we've always kind of known that some people are more attentive to details and some people have their head in the clouds, a la the intuitives. We've always thought that people can be either sort of leading with their heart, or that they kind of lead with a sort of logic or practicality and maybe ignoring their heart or the heart of others, a la thinking or feeling types, right? And so he's trying to make this case that these are the ways that we have divided people. And so he just sort of sat down to kind of classify those types. And then Myers and Briggs come along later and create this test that can sort of put them all together and give you a fuller picture of your personality type. So, I mean, that's where the theory comes from. I think people are welcome to disagree with that, but I think it makes a lot of sense that he's not just taking a snapshot of what's going on for people now, but that he's looking way back in history. He's not just looking or thinking about, the people that he was studying at the time. He's talking about the way that we've done this, the way that people classify each other, the way that people are even characterized in books and other media, plays at the time. Right, that we tend to already think about people along these lines. And so he just wrote it down.
Okay. So it kind of just seems like so it's just kind of based off of Carl Jung's research, and then there hasn't been a ton of like backlash to that. I guess there has been because there's other personality
Oh, for
tests.
sure.
So yeah, what would sort of bring someone to a different personality test outside of Myers-Briggs?
You mean what would, well, in my field, certainly on the academic side, the Myers-Briggs is sort of a bit of a taboo or a faux pas. Like, and there's a video on TikTok where I talk about why that is. I can talk about it here if you want. But it's not the most sort of celebrated or the most well used, at least in terms of academic psychology. Where we tend to see it used a lot is like in business, and we tend to see it used on the internet, just in terms of people individually coming to it. But the one that's used most in academic research is the big five, called the Neopi, or the 5-factor model. And this is extroversion. Now I'm going to forget all of them: neuroticism, openness to new experience, and then conscientiousness, and one more I'm forgetting. But this is the one that tends to be used the most in academic psychology. It seems to be because it was kind of made for academic psychology. It correlates well with things. It measures things not on a type basis the way the Myers-Briggs does, but instead on a trait basis. And so you can take those kind of, instead of just saying, are you an introvert or an extrovert, the Big Five would ask you, how much of an extrovert are you? And so I can take that person who's got a 76 on the extroversion, and that gives me better data to correlate it with, how much they like to go to parties, or what types of jobs they would enjoy, or how much they, whatever. So people like that one because it doesn't give us this sort of dichotomous, are you this or are you this? And that makes it easier to do research on it. And then there's a host of others that are actually also based on Carl Jung's work. So I believe socionics, and then also, what's the other one that's like numbers? Anyway, it's slipping my mind right now, but there's one more that is also based on Carl Jung's work, but the Myers-Briggs is the one that kind of got the most fame, and I think some of it is because it's the one that was done here in the U.S. I think those other two were done in Europe.
So then what is it about Myers-Briggs that calls to you personally?
I think the kind of grouping of it, I mean, it sort of lays out. I am more into the Jung typology personally, but I think the Myers-Briggs does a really good job of encapsulating that. I think it does a really good job of sort of slimming down the possibilities, putting together not just one type, but two types. And if you dig deep enough, you can get maybe up to all four of those types, four of your top four functions. And I feel like that is just an easy shorthand to understand people. I often get folks, and this is usually just students or even sometimes clients, where we'll talk about the Myers-Briggs, or they'll tell me they've taken one and, none of them really fit for them. And for me, sometimes I think, well, maybe the functions aren't quite put together right. So the way the Myers-Briggs works is it gives you that 4-letter type code. But what it's really telling you is that these are your top, or these are what theoretically should be your top 4 functions. Do you know your type, by the way?
Yeah, and actually every time I've taken the test, I've gotten the same letters.
Can I guess?
Yeah, I guess.
I think probably an INFJ.
No, that's my
No,
mom though.
is it? What do
Yeah.
you have?
So, ENFP.
ENFP. That's my type. Okay. So for us, for instance, our top function is extroverted intuition, and this is the part of us that is an extrovert, but it's more of an observing extrovert. ENFPs are often known as the most introverted extroverts because our most dominant way of being in the world is really kind of observing and putting things together, connecting dots, sort of, oh, this reminds me of this, or I wonder what's inside of that, or I wonder where that came from. So we're in the world, but immediately our mind sort of takes it and runs with it, and sort of asks questions or makes assumptions, et cetera, et cetera. And so because of that, even though we're in the world and we kind of back off and then go back into our head and try to make some intuitions, is what it is. Sorry, I might sneeze here in a second. About the things that we're seeing, observing. It can look like we're not extroverting, but we are. We're there. We're just not like, we're not necessarily driven to kind of act upon the world as much as we are to sort of understand and make sense of it. Our second function is called introverted feeling, and that feeling, or that function, is where we sort of we're making decisions out of this function, but we don't necessarily want to. But so our decisions are often very based on our feelings, our personal feelings. This can be to do with our emotions, but it can also be to do with our values. It can also be to do with, I believe this is right, I believe this is wrong, and so I'm going to act out of that feeling state, out of a feeling of justice or injustice, or I value or don't value, or, it's produced a strong emotion within me. And so, everybody, and we could keep going, but everybody can sort of do everything. It's sort of just where is it ranked, right? Um, and so what the Myers-Briggs says is that the most typical orientations are a certain way. And if you look at somebody's Myers-Briggs type, it's kind of making a bet or an assumption that your functions are going to line up in this typical way. But what I am interested in my research in particular is whether some people don't fit that mold, whether some people don't necessarily line up according to the 16 types, and if in fact you might get somebody who has an orientation that the Myers-Briggs wouldn't be able to categorize or wouldn't recognize, and what are those type of people like, and do we recognize or categorize them in certain other ways in psychology? So um, could you identify, for instance, autism? Could you identify ADHD? Could you identify personality disorders, right? These types of psychological things that are baked into us. They're not like, anxiety or depression, which we expect to kind of come and go. But it's like if a person has autism, if a person has ADHD, if a person has a personality disorder, then that's just who they are, right? Like that isn't something we expect to change. We can manage it, but we're not going to like make them not that person anymore. And so I'm wondering, right, could you capture some of these sort of aberrant personalities or these aberrant kind of psychological pieces in a more sophisticated version of the Myers-Briggs, which is basically just going back to measuring those functions individually rather than assuming they come together in a certain way. Did that make sense?
Yeah. So it kind of reminds. So we have Jeremy in the chat here saying that, um, like he's also an ENFP, but technically he's a ENXP.
Sure.
So it's like I guess that kind of goes into the whole thing. It's like, well, he's not, like the X sort of implies that like he's not fully like,
right,
being defined by the Myers-Briggs test. So he kind of has to like go with the closest thing. But
I would be interested. I don't know if I can't see his comment, but I don't know if Jeremy knows much about kind of the function dynamics, and I'm talking about those Jungian functions. But one of the things that I often see with ENFPs, I see this in a lot of my student ENFPs who tend to be pretty successful, kind of hardworking students, which isn't necessarily an ENFP trait. It sort of can be or can't be. We can be hardworking, or sometimes, we are and then we're not. But what I tend to see is, what I didn't get to is our third function. So I talked about the extroverted intuition and the introverted feeling. Our third function is something called extroverted thinking. And this is the function where we want to set the world to order, where we see something in the world and it needs to be fixed, or it's out of place, or it could be improved upon. And we're sort of driven to do that thing. That's our function where we do want to act upon those extroverted things. And what I see with some ENFPs is that they have a really high extroverted intuition, again, which the Myers-Briggs can't really capture. But when you look at the functions individually, you can sort of see, oh, this extroverted thinking should be in a clear third place for you, but it's almost in your second place position. And these are the type of folks who, if they take just a Myers-Briggs, which doesn't really look at those functions, it might have a hard time deciding if they're more of a feeling type or more of a thinking type. But they are a true ENFP, because an ENTP wouldn't have introverted feeling at all. They would have introverted thinking and they would have extroverted feeling, right? So that code sort of delineates, again, what it expects to be there. And if it's not what it expects, it might have a hard time and say, oh, it looks like you're gonna flip on this third letter. On this, often it's for folks, it's the first letter.
yeah, that it actually like it makes a lot of sense for me personally. Like I remember like in my like philosophy classes, um, there's like these ideas of like we should keep nature how it is. Like we like suffering is just natural, and I've always been like, no, I want to change nature. I want
Sure.
to, like, I'm a utilitarian, so I'm like, I very much want to go into the world and make it better. Decrease the suffering, increase the happiness. Um, And I never had like the intuition that like yeah, it was more like extroverted for sure.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
one thing that you can also see just in what you're saying is how that ties together with that introverted feeling piece, right? That what you're talking about sounds like things that you value, sounds like things that you feel like are about justice or about compassion or about peace, right? That that you're sort of wanting to put into play those feeling things that you have, and you're wanting to sort of put them back out into the world and sort of make some changes based on how you feel about things. And so that's a very ENFP thing to do, is to sort of um, kind of judge with your heart, but then kind of put those things into action. We're also known that when we start doing that, that we almost will turn our heart off. Like, we've made this decision, this is how it should be, or this is how it's supposed to be. And then when we're actually enacting it, we have a lot less time for feelings. That now it's just about kind of getting the work done, and we're not necessarily going to be as good or as interested in sort of stopping and smelling the roses and making sure that everybody is safe and happy in the process of kind of changing the world or whatever it is.
Yeah, that would make sense. My understanding is that a lot of like psychopaths and like sociopaths tend
Hmm.
to be utilitarian. Like
Interesting.
when you go to like the trolley problem, where like most
Mhm.
are you familiar with the trolley problem, I
Yeah, of
assume?
course.
So it's like most people like have the intuition that they should pull the lever. Some people don't have that intuition, but most people do. But when it comes to like pushing the fat man off the bridge,
Sure.
most people don't have that intuition. Where like that is like the utilitarian answer.
Right.
And so like a lot of um yeah, psychopaths and sociopaths will have the intuition and they tend to be more utilitarian. So yeah, I guess by like sort of forget what you were like explaining, like how we kind of maybe sometimes tend to push aside those emotions for like the the better consequences or better consequences.
Mhm.
Um, that would make a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're not the worst at it for sure. That if you took somebody like an ENTJ, that extroverted thinking function is their most dominant function. That kind of put the world to order function is the most dominant function for them, and an ESTJ. So both of those, um, and they tend to be a little more. And for them, it's almost like it doesn't even come into their mind until later, maybe. What you'll find with some of those types in particular is that sometimes they will fold into their plan the the necessity of caring about people's feelings, but it's really just a piece of the puzzle of, well, if I want to get everybody to be productive this week, I'm gonna have to be nice to them, or I'm gonna have to give them some time off, or I'm gonna have to make sure to encourage them, right? That it's really more a piece of the plan than it is like, oh my God, I'm so sorry I made you work so hard. Let's give you a day off, right? It sort of comes out of a thinking place more than a feeling place. And for us, I think we probably go back and forth a little more quickly, where we can slip into that extroverted thinking state where we're like, no, we just got to get shit done. And then we may reflect on that, later that day, or maybe in a few moments when we've had a second, and we're like, oh man, that was kind of a dick there. And maybe I should go back and apologize or do something nice. Um, so it's right there for us, but sometimes we feel like at least we have to flip into this mode of, we just got to get it done. It doesn't matter how people are feeling in this moment. I don't know that we tell ourselves that it doesn't matter. I think we kind of end up ignoring it, um, almost unconsciously. Like, we're just after this goal, and you know, I didn't
Yeah.
notice everybody was crying.
Yeah, it's like I use this example all the time because I think it's a really good one, but it's like Sam Harris gave a TED talk about like the dangers of AI.
Mm,
And he gave the example of like when you're walking to work and like you may step on some ants. Like
hmm
you weren't like actively like I'm gonna harm these ants.
Right.
You just had your goal of going to work and the ants happened to be there.
That's right.
Um, yeah, but then I mean, if you're reflecting on it, I guess we might be like, "Ah, man, I
Yeah,
may feel a little bit bad about stepping on all those ants," but
yeah, yeah. I think it definitely for our type, sort of, we go back and forth with that, and so that can be a struggle sometimes. And sometimes we can feel it. I think where we're like, should I do the thing that my heart is telling me to do, or should I do the most expedient thing that's gonna, get the most success or get the most out get the better outcomes that I want, right? Sometimes I feel like ENFPs and ESFPs can struggle with that because we feel them so closely together.
yeah, for sure. Um, Something I've been thinking about the past couple days is like, are do we think that certain personality types are better than others? Like, like if we, it'd be kind of a controversial, but like if there are certain traits that we tend to value more, maybe like higher IQs or like
Sure,
um, stuff like that. Ability to feel like happiness more, like yeah. Is there certain personalities that we might actually want to value more? Like if we um like could push a button and sort of that would like incentivize more people with these types of personalities to be born into existence
sure.
rather than other types, like should we do that?
No, we shouldn't do it. But I mean, to that last question, no, we shouldn't do it. But we certainly do value certain types over other types. Um, this is changing a little bit, I think, because of the internet, and because I think the internet is its own space, and it's also its own environment even in it, and it's also growing so much in such a big piece of kind of modern life that it kind of has a foothold in consciousness and et cetera, et cetera. But extroverts in general are valued more. Introverts, I believe, are more valued on the internet, or they are at least more populous on the internet, or at least more talkative, I guess. Um, but extroversion is more valued in society, right? We have certain feelings about people who are shy or quiet, or um, don't speak up, or even are kind of introspective, or um, contemplative. What we like in society is the go-getters, and the people who are good at meeting people, and the people who are good at getting things done, and the people who are good at um, have a good attention to detail, right, which is still an extroverted function. um, that, and we value thinkers more, um, and we value judgers more, right? We value those people who are doers more so than, again, those people who are maybe more observant. um, but Jung talks about that, and this is obviously all theoretical, but especially this. Jung talks about the idea that he feels like that's almost an evolutionary piece. It's almost like a built-in division of labor, where as a society, and as Americans, of course, and Westerners broadly, we like to think very individualistically, but as a society, as a race of humans, like, we need all of those components. We need the people who are a little more introspective. We need the people who are intuitive. We need the people who, just want to get stuff done. Like, we need all of those pieces, and it's about us being able to work together and use our talents and our strengths, to provide for all of us as a race, as a society. That's the most important thing. But yeah, we certainly do value certain types over others. Myers, in her book, talks about the fact that that seems to be a cultural piece too, where, for instance, she says, and this book was written maybe 30 years ago, she says that in the United States, we tend to value intuitives more, whereas in England, she's talking about specifically, or the UK, she says they tend to value sensors more. They tend to value sort of the more literal. And as Americans, we sort of value the, like, what could it be? What could we build from this? Where can we take it? What does it mean? Uh, so I think it's cultural, but I think in general, we need all of us. And if we could push that button, I think we'd kind of break society if everybody was an ENTJ, which is, the most successful and often kind of praised type because they're really good at putting an idea into practice and building businesses and making things happen, and that's super valued today. But we need the other types, or we probably all just be fighting with each other for status and place and money.
Gotcha. So they all kind of have a piece in the puzzle. Um, yeah, that would make sense. I do like the idea of like everyone working together. Like it's good that when I go if I take a flight somewhere, I don't have to like learn how to fly a plane. I don't
Right,
have to like you have all these different other people playing roles in the system, and all I have to do is just check my bags and hop on.
right,
Um,
right. Or even things that might feel, for an ENFP, a lot of things often feel kind of mundane for us, and some of that stuff we just have to do anyway, right? But other things, there are people that do that. I'm not necessarily very good with cars. I'm good at figuring things out. You probably are too. Good at figuring things out that have some interest in me. So I'm good at fixing a computer because that's interesting to me. But something that's probably pretty similar, fixing a car in a lot of ways, that's not so interesting to me. So I tend to be bad at it. But there are people that just love any sort of mechanical work, that love any sort of, and we could say, based on kind of the first thing we were talking about, that might be based on their type, that maybe they're sort of drawn to that kind of literal mechanical, how does it work? How can we put it together? How can we, etc. And that it's good that there are people that are interested in doing that, as well as people that are interested in sitting down and reading books and talking about the theories we find inside of them.
yeah, I mean I think I half agree and half don't agree. Like
Sure.
I think both can be true that we all, need to work together and certain traits sort of make up for other traits, but also I think there may be certain traits that we may want to sort of try and phase out.
Like what?
Um, well, like if someone is more like um, well, I think IQ is like would be one. Um, I think we should incentivize like higher IQs and stuff. I don't know how we'd actually do that, but just like theoretically, or like if someone's more susceptible to experiencing like higher amounts of suffering, um,
Hmm.
stuff like that.
But you have to think of the good side of those things too. So one, I'm
Oh, you just froze.
something about somebody testing it, which is that each of the functions may be a type of intelligence, that we could maybe even think of it that way. Um, and then people who are susceptible to suffering, those people are also, um, and ENFPs are not at the top of this list, but we're sort of at the top half of this list. The people who are more susceptible to suffering, that also breeds a certain sympathy or empathy, right? Because I know how that would make me feel, or I know how that feels, or I see how badly that's hurting you, right? Like that. I feel like those are two sides of the same coin. That to know suffering is to know suffering, right? And if you're a person who's kind of impervious to that, or more impervious to that, I think you're going to be also more impervious to the sensitivity, the sympathy, and the empathy that comes along with those things.
Gotcha. Like so, it may have some sort of like instrumental value.
I think so.
Where
Yeah.
gotcha. Um, yeah, I think we might just have to move on because I would still disagree.
That's okay. I
I
mean,
think
it's fine.
like
It's fine to
I
disagree
guess
with me.
the real like yeah like the I guess sort of the controversial take is that um like I kind of hold the a Brave New World perspective
Hmm.
where like it's better like it's better to be happy than it is to be free, kind of
Hmm.
thing where um and also that we should sort of be active in changing the world. Um, and there are certain traits that I think are more valuable than others. But something I did want to talk about is the how big of a misunderstanding people have of extroversion and introversion. So um like people tend to think that extroversion is just you're energetic and like um you're the big guy in the room. And introversion is just like you like to be home more or something. Yeah, can you kind of talk about the misunderstandings of extroversion and introversion? Um, looks like you may. Oh, are you back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about
Did
that. My internet's being weird. So you were saying
yeah.
misconception.
Yeah, the misconceptions. Do you want to talk about the misconceptions of like extroversion and introversion?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the basic Jung's at least basic idea, and different psychologists or different personality theories, I guess I should say, um, sort of take this in a different direction. I'm with Jung on this, but the idea is that extroverts, because we're talking about psychology, and psychology's had this weird sort of drift, I think, in the last 50 years, where we're almost mostly studying sociology these days, more so than psychology, like kind of what's going on in people's heads, and how that's operating, and all the things that is what I think psychology is about. And so the idea of the introvert or the extrovert isn't about how people are interacting or what they're doing, right? Again, that's almost that like social psych or almost sociology. How are you interacting with others? Um, the idea of introvert extrovert is what is your mental state? Where's your mental state focused? And so for the extrovert, it's going to be focused on the outside world. And this is a thing that I think most people can notice about themselves, is that they have these two places they can sort of be. One is focused on the outside world and thinking about things and thinking about the people around you or interacting with those things, etc., observing those things. And then the other place is kind of just in your head, like solving a problem or wondering how you feel about a certain thing. That's, you could be almost anywhere and do those kind of introverted things. And so the real difference between the introvert and the extrovert is just which of those do you do more, understanding that everybody, unless there's something profoundly unique about you, everybody can do both of those. Everybody does both of those, right? And the difference between the introvert and extrovert is just which one do you do more. This is why I mean, I think it's fine. Like, I don't hate it or anything, but for me, this is why I don't really buy into the idea of the ambivert. It's because everybody's ambiverting. Everybody's sort of can do both and is going back and forth. But the idea of the introvert extrovert is just kind of which one predominates. Which one, if I just came upon you, 100 random times, are you more likely to be doing in those instances? And the extroverts are going to be more likely to sort of be dealing with the world around them, and introverts are going to be more likely to sort of be dealing with the world within them. Um, so I think the misunderstanding is sort of a drift of that idea and a drift of what may come with my definition or Jung's definition of introvert extrovert, which is that if you're more likely to be focused on the outside world, if you're more likely to be focused on people and things, well, then you're going to be drawn to do things with people and do things with things and to want to fix or change or interact with or understand. And so, yeah, you're going to be more likely to go to a party, which is often the sort of stereotypical question around that, because there's things and people there and you can have conversations and all of this stuff. Uh, and if you're an introvert, you might love going to parties, but you will also be aware that because that's sort of not where your psychology resolves, that if just left to your own devices, you kind of go inward. That if I say come to this party, well, you have to do a little work. It might not be a whole lot. For other people, it might be a lot, but you have to do a little work to now press yourself outward and sort of be in the realm of people and things, be in this extroverted realm. By that same token, if I take an extrovert and I say, let's go meditate, or I say, I want you to sit down and write 2 pages on your emotional state at this moment, like that's going to be a thing that's going to be more daunting to them. They can do it, but they're going to have to, again, sort of take that extroverted psychology and say, well, now I need to do a little work to turn it inward. And that's going to be a little harder. It's going to make them tired eventually if they have to do it for a long time. And so there is some truth to that idea of gaining energy in one place or the other. But often the way I see it stated is that it's about being alone versus being with people. And an introvert that is comfortable with you can introvert right in front of you. Like, they're zoned out, they're doing their own thing, they're reading a book, they're writing something down, or whatever it is. Um, it's if you're the type of person, or certainly if you're the type of extrovert that's always like, hey, what are you doing? Hey, do you want to do this? Hey, like that's going to drain them. But it's not necessarily your presence or your lack of presence. The same token, you could be an extrovert who wants to be alone and is, designing something, or even just watching television or working on something. Those are all kind of extroverted things, and you don't have to have people around, but you might like it, you might not. So I just try to get to that kind of central psychological piece. Where is your psychology going? Where is your mental focus going to resolve if I just let you do whatever you want? Where does it want to be? And there are some correlations. There are some things that come along with that, but those things aren't the definitive piece for me. The definitive piece is that, what's your psychology up to?
Gotcha. Yeah, a couple of things like to me it kind of the whole like ambivert thing reminds me of like conversations in like agnosticism versus like atheism,
Sure.
stuff like that, where it's like maybe like I hold the view that everybody's agnostic, and then whether you're a theist or an atheist is just where you land on that sort of scale. But
Sure.
I also like the idea of with like introversion and extroversion, like the I think it's really cool looking at like shy extroverts or
Sure.
like charismatic introverts.
Sure.
So you could have somebody who's really outgoing and really friendly and able to, get an audience, and but left to their own sort of devices, they're actually a introvert. Um, yeah, that's extremely interesting to me. It's always has been. Yeah.
Yeah, often well, I think it can just be that way, right? They're sort of exercising those other functions that, that charismatic introvert probably still wants to get away from it all and eventually be by themselves so they can do, and again, not necessarily be by themselves, but like be around people or be by themselves where they can kind of go back into their introverted space and do the things that they sort of naturally do. And the same for the extrovert who's um, kind of taking time and being pensive and doing quote introverted things is probably eventually going to say, man, I'd really like to interact with something or someone, or go somewhere where there's interesting things to see and do. Like that, it's gonna sort of pop up eventually. One thing I think, I don't remember who said this, I want to say it's Myers, but it might not have been her. They say that often we can develop kind of a secondary type. And so if you're an introvert and your job is to be in front of people or be on stage or be a leader of people, there's probably a particular character that you maybe could type that character that they put on in those moments, that they're not a random extrovert every time they have to lead a group of people, that they probably become a certain extrovert. That's probably some derivation of their type already. And that is kind of who they become in that moment. And then they sort of, it's almost a code switch, right? They sort of code switch back to their original self when they can. Um, but yeah, again, we can all do all of it. It's just um, again, where are we more comfortable? And then I think in terms of doing stuff that's a little out of our typing, what do we have experience with, and what are our personal interests and likes and goals, etc.
Yeah. Like personally, I've experienced sort of like uh times in my life where I start to be more introverted or start to exhibit more introverted traits.
For sure.
So like I have bipolar disorder, and tend like when I go more like depressed, I tend to start having more introverted traits. Now I would say that like I'm pretty much always extroverted. Like the introverted traits never really outweigh the extroverted
Mm,
ones, but
mm.
I do see yeah, times in my life where the traits that like they start to switch over. So yeah, I do have that experience.
When you say that, does that mean like um being alone, or do you mean that you get, for ENFP it'd probably be in your feelings more, so it's about kind of, or both?
Yeah, both. Like I tend to like usually I'm thinking more about like the outside world, like what are my friends up to, like how
Sure.
can I yeah, and then but yeah, when I'm more depressed, I get more like kind of the stereotypical things like I don't want to go to the parties or anything.
Sure.
I'd want to stay in my room and write or something like that.
Yep.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common, I mean, maybe not to the degree, but that is a pretty common trait of ENFPs and ENTPs, to be fair, um, where I think it's because of the way our intuition works. And sort of not necessarily talking about the bipolar piece of it, but just the way our intuition works, that sometimes we need to process what we've been experiencing, what we've been doing, what we've been feeling, etc. And so that kind of working through things is not uncommon for ENXPs, for instance.
that's cool. Yeah, I'm starting to see a lot more like the utility in knowing your personality type or knowing not just knowing yours but knowing other people's.
Sure, I think
Right.
so.
So it's like if uh yeah, I guess if you have a familiarity with the different types and you're seeing someone act a certain way, and you're like, "Well, what? Like what the hell? Like
Hmm.
why?" And then but then if you know the types, you can sort of better understand that. Um,
Yeah, I agree with that.
yeah,
One thing I like about this theory is that it doesn't really attempt to explain or predict what a person will do, but it will help you understand what they've done, where they were coming from, or where they're going to come from, right? And so if you put a feeling type, talking about the trolley problem, one thing I've wanted to figure out how to do is to put some version of that in a personality test, because I think it's telling about whether a person is sort of thinking emotionally or if they're thinking practically, and at what point does that emotionality switch to practicality, or vice versa, right? And so I think one of the things that the Myers-Briggs and Young's functions do is it kind of helps you understand people's frame or state of mind, so that when they've done something you can go, oh well, of course, he wasn't gonna sacrifice or wasn't gonna touch the lever. Um, he wanted he's thinking emotionally, and how's that going to make him feel that he was involved in the killing of one or a bunch of people, right? And so that wasn't a great example, but I mean, you can sort of just begin to think that way about how people are acting if you can sort of understand where they're coming from, how they're making decisions, how they're seeing the world. um, and I think you can, of course, do that for yourself, and that can help you understand, I don't know, where you stand in things, and maybe not judge yourself or judge other people, because you're kind of coming from a different basis, and it would make sense that they would do X, and it would make sense that I wouldn't or would do X.
yeah, yeah. No, like especially with the trolley problem. What I find interesting as far as like people's like personality motives, um, their answers tend to change when you sort of um, push back so some of the emotion. So it's like, again, like most people will pull the lever, but most people won't push the fat man off the ridge.
Sure.
But it's like it's the same consequences, but like one tends to have more emotion. What you're more involved,
Hmm.
where it's like they may like a lot of them may push the fat man off the bridge if it was just a button and the fat man was across the country,
Sure.
right? Um, so
But the
yeah,
act
like
of doing it feels a little more intense.
exactly, yeah, yeah. So I can see where personality types may like, especially if you're more into like the if you're using feeling as more of a justification. Um, yeah, interesting.
Very cool.
So are you into philosophy at all, or is it really just like the psychology and social? I mean, they do tie together pretty heavily, but
I've seen some of your videos. I don't think I could keep up with you, but sort of in passing, I've looked at some philosophy, took some courses in college, but um, not to the degree that I could quote philosophers at you and different kind of um, broad theories of philosophy, even.
gotcha. Yeah, I'm just curious because I to me I see a ton of overlap with the conversations of psychology and philosophy.
Sure.
Um, I think despite all my issues I have with them, I am like I think like Jordan Peterson is like an example of that, where he's like kind of in sort of both spaces.
I
Um,
think so. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, psychology really grew out of philosophy and
yeah,
anthropology to some degree. Um, Around the turn of the century, the 20th century, um, we really tried to hitch our wagon to medicine, and a medical model, and I think in that time we sort of almost excised some of those more philosophical roots. Um, you can see it still happening today with the way people talk about, I think less so than maybe 10 years ago, but the way that people talk about Freud and the way that people talk about Jung and all of those sort of theorists who are thinking in philosophical ways and then trying to see if they can apply that philosophy or observe that philosophy in individuals. Um, but today we want to take this very kind of medicalized, um, everything has to be empirical approach where I'm certainly for empiricism, but I don't think we have a sophisticated enough understanding of ourselves and our psychology, or even the brain, if you just want to start there, to make everything empirical at this point. I think common sense is still important, right? That there are things that I think humans know about themselves and each other that we like to ignore, and I think um, we can formulate a test that is going to validate that kind of willful ignorance for us, or we won't test it, or so I think there are all of these things that we kind of have to get an understanding of about ourselves in an honest way before we say, well, everything has to be um, proven in a study or demonstrable in an empirical way before we can believe it or even talk about it, or even test it. The Myers-Briggs is caught up in this, right? That it's not true. It actually does have a lot of empirical evidence, but that's what they like to pull out against it, is that, oh, it's not empirical, it's just based on theory. Well, that's not true, but if it were and it makes sense to people and people can understand themselves in this way, isn't this what we're after? Versus we're getting it with a really high confidence interval, but it makes no sense to people. if so, I'm on a tangent, but if I tell somebody they're an introvert versus an extrovert, that makes sense to them. If I tell them they're an extrovert at 89.64%, like, what's the difference between that and 80% or 90% or 70%, right? Like that that number, that kind of big five number is more empirical. It's easier to test around and to understand and to repeat, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't really make sense to the way that humans think about themselves or each other.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I think I know what you're talking about. So the the sort of the human experience matters. Like empiricism matters, right? But the human experience sort of matters before that. Like on
Agree.
that's like has a higher like I gave this example on my Facebook uh yesterday where I said like if somebody um if it was true that by somebody believing that 2 plus 2 was 4, like just gave them like tremendous amounts of torture, like they're just thrown into a torture chamber because
Mm-hmm.
they believe the truth. It's like, well, why ought they believe the truth? Like, why should we tell them that 2 plus 2 is 4?
Right.
Like, yeah, tell them that it's 5. So, um, yeah, again, is it like, um, what's more valuable, like our experience of like well-being or just the truth? And it seems to me that the truth is only instrumentally valuable, um, because it tends to increase our happiness. But
But
yeah,
yeah, not always. And I'm not one of these people, but like the especially in kind of science, the truth, because one of the things about science is like, as opposed to like philosophy, is that scientists would sort of contend that we arrive, or at least we are attempting to arrive at a truth. Like, this is true. It's not a maybe. It's not something we're speculating or thinking about or talking about or discussing. Like, at the end of this study, if all goes according to plan, we will have an answer. We will have a truth about this thing that we're studying. Um, but the back end of that is not about truth. What questions did I decide to ask? Who did I decide to get to observe or run the test? When did I do it? With whom? Right? Like, and some of those things are accidental, of course, but the assertion that we're always arriving at truth, or that things that are empirical are always going to be better than things that are maybe common sense, or um, I don't know, that people even just have a sense of personal truth about that's always going to be better than those other things. I'm not sure. I'm not there yet. Of course, I do. I'm a scientist, so I do lean on the side of empiricism. I want that. I want to be able to find the evidence for things, but I also don't just blindly trust it. We're almost at religion at that point where you just say, "Oh, well, there's a study for it, so it must be true." It's like, well, let's look at the basis of that study and see what they were really about, and see, is there refuted evidence? Is there refuting studies that we could look at too? So anyway, but for me, that's all science. But I don't know that we necessarily use it that way anymore. Sometimes we just like to hold our paper up and go, "See, I proved it."
yeah, I like 1,000% agree on that. There's this well, issue of really everything that is sort of based on an induction,
Hmm.
um, where yeah, you can sort of like make these like deductions based on like these premises and stuff, but the premises again are based off of um, so it's like yeah, you can have like a premise of like, okay, the law of gravity is true, um, you know, but in order for that to be true, we have to. It's like it's only true because every time we've tested the law of gravity, we've gotten the same results,
Hmm.
right? Um, I know. I believe it's like David Hume that gave sort of the example of like um, a chicken gets fed dinner every day at 6. So like in the chicken's world, like 6 p.m. is like a law of gravity. It's like his
Hmm. Hmm.
entire life, every day at 6 you get food. But then one day, the farmer comes at 6 with a knife. It's no longer dinner time. It's dinner time for the farmer,
Sure.
right? So it's like sort of theoretically possible that, what goes up must come down. So it's like every time I if I lift a pen up and drop it, it's like, law of gravity is like saying that, yeah, the pen's gonna fall. But just like in the chicken case, it could be one day you have the pen up and then you let go and it doesn't fall. So, but then again, like it's kind of, it's kind of silly to assume that it's not going to fall.
Right.
So what it comes down to is just like, yeah, everything is sort of based on induction, but where's it's like, what are the odds, right? Like,
Sure.
these aren't like Vegas odds. It's like there's a very, very, very high likely chance that the
Right.
pen's gonna fall. Yeah. I
Yeah,
don't know
and
if
I
that makes any
mean,
sense, but
no, for sure, but and even something like gravity. One of the few things in science we've decided to call a law, right? Um, if we can sort of even imagine a moment where that law wouldn't come to fruition, right? That's something. But then more modern, I don't want to say modern, but a lot of other science, modern or not, doesn't even have that level of certainty, right? It's maybe a study or two, and we might run with that, or we might kind of change the whole plan or change the whole way that we're doing things just because we found a study or two that's I don't know, and so I'm not trying to be certainly anti-science, but I just think we have to be careful, and I think we have to be critical of our science, and I think we can't forget about our own intuitive, if you like, but our own experience of things that maybe suggest something different, or maybe suggest something different for us, or in this place, in this time, in this experience. Because science can certainly get it wrong, and even really good science, sometimes we come around and go, you know what, we forgot to add this variable, or we forgot to consider these people in this study, and it's not true for them, or it's not true in this situation. So I just think we have to be thoughtful and careful, and not be such zealots about science, especially when it counters what we sort of know to be true, or have known to be true for ourselves or others.
yeah. And I guess one controversial take from me, wouldn't be as controversial in sort of like philosophical circles, but in like the scientific circles, definitely is like, I'm not even convinced that objective truth is real.
Sure.
Um, so like having that as like sort of the main goal, like,
Hmm.
sure, it sort of has instrumental value, but like for me, the goal should be what what beliefs are going to have better consequences when it comes to maximizing happiness.
Hmm.
Um,
Happiness is a hard one for me, because it's so fleeting, and it's so, you know even fickle. Something might make a person happy today, and then a week later it's like they hate it. ENFPs are known for this, right?
sure.
That Young says something, I'm going to butcher this, but he says about ENFPs and ENTPs. He says, um, they find this thing and it's going to be the answer. I'm butchering it, but it's a paraphrase. But they find this thing and it's going to be the answer. It's going to be the thing that they're searching for. It's going to change their life. And no sooner do they have it than it becomes their new prison, right? That this thing that they thought was going to be amazing um, turns out to be the thing that in a little while they're like, God, now I have to keep doing that thing, or now I'm stuck with this, or boy, I sure would like it if I could move on. Um, and so for me, happiness is this sort of, you know, thing that isn't, I don't know. I think it would be hard to base a value system on happiness. I think maybe well-being. I think maybe safety, security, some of those sort of lower Maslow's hierarchy pieces. Um, but I think happiness is just hard. Is just hard, and I don't even know if that's exactly what you meant.
Gotcha. Yeah. So when I say happiness, or pleasure, happiness, well-being, they're pretty much just all synonymous with each other.
Okay.
So I could just say that we should focus on well-being. Um,
Sure, that makes sense
yeah,
to me. In my head, I think about it as the difference between dopamine and serotonin, um, where serotonin is the well-being. That's the one they put in antidepressants, or they encourage in antidepressants. Um, that just makes you feel okay. Like, it's fine. It's good. I'm good today. Um, Maybe not elated, maybe not even happy, but like nothing's wrong, right? I'm good. Whereas dopamine is the one that's like, woo, like I love it. That's great. More of that, please. Um,
yeah. Well, what if you did just have more of that? Like, it seems like the at least for me, like the reason like these dopamine rushes are bad is because they stop. You'll revert back to
sure.
but if you could have like the dopamine rush and it just continues growing, there is no like um reverting back to the suffering. Um, what would be your issue with that?
I think we'd be a whole other species. I think we're sort of more than we know are based on this sort of pleasure versus suffering dichotomy, and that a certain amount of suffering is needed to search for, to appreciate pleasure and happiness. That if you're always happy, you know, it will eventually lose its meaning, right? Um, like it would be like a capitalism of happiness, like you're just trying to claw and scrape to get to keep moving upwards in a way that is probably over the long term unrealistic, and may cause problems. Not that we should cause suffering, but I just mean our ability to experience it and know it in the same way that I was kind of talking about it being a way that we can understand or use empathy and sympathy. I think our capability for suffering makes our capability for happiness and pleasure that much stronger.
Yeah, I mean, there is an argument to be made that like um, suffering is necessary for higher amounts of pleasure. Um, and and um, and I mean, I would sort of hold that view as well, right? Like if I could create a world that's just full of really happy people, like full of people, full of well-being, but I had to like give somebody a paper cut in order for that world to exist. Like it wouldn't be wrong to cause that
Mm,
suffering.
mm,
Um,
hmm.
right.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes me think of the four noble truths, right? To live is to suffer, and the fourth, of course, like there is a way out of suffering, but it's to kind of let go of everything, which is to basically say to let go of the things that bring you pleasure, because those things can also, and maybe inevitably will, bring you pain, bring you suffering. And so for me, they just go together. Um, and it doesn't seem like it, but I feel like there are these two opposites, like black and white go together. Like what is one without the other? Um, that pleasure and pain go together.
Uh, I mean, I can see where you're coming from. There's this guy Epicurus who gets a lot of flack, hedonism. Um,
Mhm.
People think hedonism to just be like, you know, try and maximize pleasure, like go out and have orgies and you know.
Mhm.
But Epicurus was a minimalist. Um,
Mhm.
and Epicurus um believed in like um reducing your desires, reducing sort of your like immediate pleasures. Like he said, Epicurus said that the highest like amount of pleasure is friendship.
Mhm.
Um, so I think there is maybe some confusion with a lot of people where when we say maximize well-being or maximize happiness, um, oftentimes that sort of does mean um, reducing um, reducing things that have pleasure because perhaps desire, almost like Buddhism, right? Perhaps
Mm.
desire is actually the issue here.
So you're saying like be a hedonist with low desires? Is that
Well, I don't even necessarily think I hold that position. I'm just saying I can kind of uh, that's what the perspective sort of sounds like, of like what you're saying. Um,
yeah, I mean, for me that would be I mean, I don't know. I am certainly kind of theorizing right now, but like
yeah,
for me, that would be one of those things that's sort of baked into our humanity, right? This idea that we desire things and that we want things and that we're drawn to things. I mean, it's sort of how we function in terms of food, in terms of sex, in terms of money, in terms of like everything. It's usually backed by some desire, even if it's just protection or safety, take care of your family, make people happy. But those things are all about desire. And so I think in a species of desirers, hedonism means well, what people think it means. It means that people are going to sort of lean into those. And I have no problem with it with a hedonist. Um, but you know, I don't think it's necessarily possible that or fair that we could expect any of us to sort of just turn that desire off. I think that's harder than just choosing a different life philosophy. I don't know if that made sense to you.
no, I think it does. I hold the view that we don't choose our desires. So we've got like Christian in the chat saying the desire to not desire, and like yeah, like
Mm.
I think that's a really good point because it's like in order to not desire some or like change your desire, you have a desire to not desire it.
Hmm.
And I'm not really convinced that we choose our desires.
Yeah, I
It's just
certainly
kind of
don't. I don't
yeah,
think so. I think we can grow them and learn them, and I don't think they're necessarily like innate or a priori. There's a little philosophy I remember. I don't necessarily think that they are all sort of baked in that way. I think some of them are certainly learned, or like you grow a taste for, or um, you experience and you want more of, right? So I think some of those things um, are learned, but I think once you have a desire for something, yeah, I don't think you can turn it off of your own volition. I think you can ignore it until it dies. I think you can sort of, you know, let it die, but I don't think you can say, you know what, I don't want to like coffee anymore, so I'm going to just not like it. Right. I think maybe I could stop drinking coffee and eventually lose a taste for it or forget that I liked it. But I don't think that's really under our control once it's sort of on the slate of our desires.
yeah, and the yeah, like even with the ignoring aspect, you'd have to have a desire to ignore it.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah. So this, I guess, sort of circling back to because we kind of got on a tangent, circling back to personality types. Um,
Sure.
the so what do you think of the idea that people can choose their personality types?
No.
Yeah,
I
same.
don't think so. I think you can choose to behave a certain way. I think you can choose to, that's what acting is, right? I think you can sort of choose to behave a certain way. But I think in general, your focus and your desires or what you um, sort of know about things or how you see the world or whether you choose to act or not act kind of over a broad sense, not case by case. Uh, I think that it just is. I think that just is. And by that, I don't mean like it doesn't develop from somewhere. And by that, I don't mean it can't change over time. But I think, like, at any given moment, like, a person is who they are. And um, you can't sort of choose your way into, I mean, in the same way a person kind of can't choose what they like and dislike, as we were talking about, I don't think we have that capability to say, you know what, I'm a thinking type and I'd really rather be a feeling type. I think I could act that way. I think I could ask people, are you okay? And do these things. You may even be able to train some of those things into yourself, but I don't think it's not the choice that's doing that. It's the choice that's causing you to decide to learn how to do this or pay more attention or be more mindful to. And then maybe that will, grow that particular function or that particular trait such that it is showing up more. But I don't think it's, again, a matter of desire or picking. I think however we come to be the way that we are, we come to be the way that we are.
Yeah, and to me, it just reminds me of like our earlier conversation about empirics, where it's like it first sort of comes from the person. It starts with the human experience. So it's
Mhm.
like, sure, you can maybe yeah, act in a way that isn't really in alignment with your personality, but that's coming from your personality to start from.
Yeah, great point. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's something about who you are actually has made you right. And yeah, there's definitely people who don't like their personality type, or people who admire other types and want to be that type, or maybe even convince themselves that they are actually that type because they sit down and they take a test and they answer the way that they would like, they would like to answer, they would like to answer. Um, without any real insight or maybe even fabricating it on purpose as to who they are. So, um, yeah, I really like that idea that the desire to be different is coming from the actual person that you are.
Yeah. Um, so that kind of brings up. So I know a lot of people have the worry that like when they're taking the test, um,
Mm-hmm.
there's sort of picking the answers that they want to pick rather than the answers that are accurate. Um, but maybe the act of doing that is still coming from their personality. What do you think about that?
Oh, sure. If I put, from my TikTok channel, I've done research where I've sort of just used online samples versus random sample, which is less scientific, to be fair, but you get a much larger sample if you don't limit yourself to the people in your Psych 101 class. Um, you will find a predominance of people who are interested in personality, who are interested in taking the test, and so there is definitely kind of a self-selection um, piece at work in terms of who's drawn to this stuff and in terms of who's interested and who they want to be, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of INFPs, a lot of INFJ, a lot of NFs, basically, intuitive feeling types, um, will be interested in this type of stuff. And then a lot of STs could care less, like they're very literal people and they're not necessarily um, as interested in others as feeling types are. So there is certainly some self selection that happens here.
Yeah. So well, I'm wondering if the self like sort of selection um would give like inaccurate results. Or is that something we should actually be worried about?
Um, I don't think necessarily. I mean, I think it's sort of a different issue. I think the self selection is one thing. I think another thing is kind of what we were talking about earlier in terms of which types are more desirable, if someone could press a button and make more. Like, I think those are the things that people are self-selecting into, is what either they value and or what they think the world values. So a lot of people I will see self-select into an INTJ or an INFJ uh, typing. And for the INTJ, it's because this type has been called the most intelligent type. And so I think a lot of people who maybe are close on some traits, but could sort of flip an answer or sort of fib or delude themselves on a couple answers and could get themselves pretty close to that INTJ. For instance, there are other types this would be true to for too. um, that's what I tend to see, is that those kind of really, like INTJ, for instance, just on this, is one of the rarest types. When we kind of test it in a random sample, it is one of the rarest types. But online, you see so many. Like, and if I do a personality test, I'll get like a way over representation of people reporting, at least, that they're an INTJ. And then there are some types that are not very, people find them not to be very desirable. I see a lot of people, um, and I don't know if this is actually true for the INFP, but I see a lot of people kind of ragging on the INFP in such a way that they, I can imagine them trying to self-select out of that. And often when I see them self-selecting into, or at least kind of coding themselves as, is an INFJ. When in fact, if we test them based on their functions, or, you know, in some cases, just based on the kind of interactions, it seems more like an INFP than an INFJ. So anyway, yeah, I think there's some self-selection going on, but I think it's a little bit different than kind of the grouping of who's showing up. And then I think overall there are certain types, or certain, and certain people may not even know the names, like INFJ or whatever, but they just may get a question. For instance, it might even be down to the question level, where it's, I'm, for instance, I'm very thoughtful about things, or I'm a good judge of character, or I seem to know more than other people do about certain things, right? That, and that those are poorly written questions, because there is sort of a bias in terms of what anyone would probably want to answer. But at that question level, they will sort of answer in the more approved way, and that will kind of put them in this grouping.
What seems to be more like the right answer, the more
Yeah,
like yeah.
yeah,
So yeah, so what are some steps people could take to sort of navigate through that to try and get more accurate results?
great. I always tell people, whether or not I think they've been mistyped, or they are just, they've taken the test a few times and they get several different types and they're not really sure. I tell people to go read about each of those types. So let's say you get, three that you keep going back and forth between. Go read the description, and if necessary, and maybe even if you don't think it's necessary, read it with somebody who knows you well. Because in the same way that you may delude yourself on a question, you may delude yourself on, judging, am I like this, or do I do this thing that this description is saying? So alone, or even better with somebody else, go read the descriptions, and one of them should sound more like you. One of them should get it better than the other two. In most cases, not always, but in most cases, this will be relatively clear. I'll do this with my students. We'll have them take a test in class, and they're like, "Oh, I got it this time, but I've gotten this in the past," or it's really close on these two. And so I'll read the two types to them, and one of them they'll say, "Okay, that sounds a little bit like me," and then the one that's accurate, often they'll go, "Oh, it's that one. It's that one." Right? I'm definitely like that. And so I tell people to go do that. And so that's, for me, back to the map is not the land. Like, the test can get it wrong, even if you're doing your best and you're not trying to be a certain person and you're not trying to delude, whatever. The test can just get it wrong. It can ask a question that doesn't really get at it for you. It can ask questions that have an inherent bias to them, et cetera, et cetera. But if the descriptions of the types are right, the theories around how they actually are in the world and how they think within themselves, then one of those should stick for you. Caveat is this idea that I've been talking about in terms of the Myers-Briggs is making some assumptions about how the functions will line up. But we don't have, I'm working on it, but we don't have a really good test for helping folks who don't fit within that kind of normal Myers-Briggs regimen to kind of figure out, well, what's my type like? How do my functions align? And what does that say about me? We don't really have something for those aberrations quite yet.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think so we're about an hour and a half now. So I think we may need to call it. It's been a good chat.
Sure thing.
I guess I would say give your as we're signing off, I would say give your best argument for and we kind of already did this, but just like
Sure.
the spark notes, right? Give your best argument for Myers-Briggs personality test and why it's a utility maximizing to know your letters, and then where can people find you?
Awesome. Thanks. So I would just say that it's just about knowing yourself, and I think eliminating any strife when comparing yourself to others on things that you might feel like they're doing better than you, or that they seem to be gifted in, or they seem to find easier, and instead finding those things that are the things that you're going to be gifted in, the things that you're going to be better at, and the things that you may be drawn to. Because for a lot of people, they may not know those things. There's stuff, there's things that I imagine people find. I know I certainly have, where you get into it and you're like, oh man, I was like born for this. Why have I never done this or heard of this or tried this before? And I think if something can give you a little bit of an edge on that, and you're not wasting as much time, not necessarily that it's wasted, but it could be wasted time on things that really just aren't for you, or judgments that you have to make about yourself that you don't necessarily have to do. And so for those reasons, and just because it's fun, I think, just to know about yourself and learn who you are and why you do things, and get a better understanding of yourself, or your friends, or your family, all that. You can find me on TikTok. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on YouTube. TikTok's the one I'm probably most active on right now. And all of those are at Aqualus, which is my first name, if you can see it on the screen there. At Aqualus, and you can find me on most of those platforms.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming. Thanks for the chat.
You got it. Thanks for having me, man. It was fun. You kind of exercised my brain today. It's a good time.
Appreciate it, man.
Yeah.